something just changed in this case, and it's not small. For the first time, this isn't just people speculating or trying to piece things together from the outside. This is something real, something that can actually be verified. Because up until now, everything about Ashlee's case has felt off in a way people couldn't fully explain. The story was there, the explanation was there, but it never fully connected. It always felt like something was missing. And a lot of people felt that even if they couldn't put it into words. But now, there's a shift, because a hotel professional with over 10 years of experience just stepped in and broke something down in a way that changes how you look at everything. Not emotionally, but structurally. The kind of insight that only comes from understanding how these systems actually work behind the scenes. And that's where things start getting serious. Because according to her, everything comes down to one thing: the room, the door, who went in and who came out. Because in a high-end resort like that, nothing just happens without a record. There are systems in place that track movement, access, timing, everything. Digital logs that show exactly when doors are opened, who used a key, when someone entered, when they left. That's standard. That's not optional. And if those systems exist, which they do, then there should already be answers. But there aren't. And that's where things start to feel wrong again. Because if this situation was as simple as it was first presented, if everything lined up cleanly, then this case would already be closed. But it's not. It's still open. And now we're starting to see why. Because if what she's saying is true, then the truth isn't missing. It's already there. And that changes everything. And once you understand that, the next part hits immediately. Because this isn't just theory anymore. This is how hotels actually operate. A professional with over a decade of experience broke it down clearly, and what she said lines up with how high-end resorts are built to function. If something happens between guests, especially anything involving tension or conflict, the first move is simple. They separate them, not because something extreme happened, but because that's protocol, that's standard, and that matters more than people realize. Because it tells you something important right away. If there was no immediate danger, no visible violence, no sign that someone was a threat to themselves or anyone else, then the situation at that moment wasn't being treated as something critical. It was being treated as something manageable. And that changes how you look at everything that comes after. Because now you're not starting from a place of emergency. You're starting from a place where the system believed things were under control. And that's where the timeline starts tightening again. Because if things were stable enough to just separate people, then what exactly changed after that? What happened in that space where everything went from controlled to completely out of control? And here's where it gets even more interesting. People were questioning how another room was suddenly available, like it didn't make sense that a resort could just move someone like that. But according to her, that's normal too. High-end hotels always keep extra rooms open, not for situations like this specifically, but for flexibility. HVAC issues, guest complaints, last-minute changes. It happens all the time. So that part of the story actually checks out. And that's important, because it removes one layer of confusion, but it adds another one. Because now you're left with a clearer picture of what didn't happen. There was no immediate chaos, no visible emergency that forced drastic action, just a standard response. Separation, and then after that, everything changes. And that's where the real question starts forming. If everything was normal enough to follow standard protocol, then what caused it to stop being normal?
If there's security footage, that will tell the story. So we just want to know if there's any security footage, if there's anything just to saying that what he's saying is true.
The hotel hasn't responded to them, but did provide a brief statement to ABC News, saying they were deeply saddened by a tragic incident involving one of our guests.
And once you understand that the situation was stable enough to follow normal protocol, the next layer hits even harder, because now it's not just about what happened, it's about what should have been recorded when it happened. This is where everything shifts, because we're not dealing with guesses anymore, we're dealing with systems, real systems that track everything. According to the hotel professional, places like this don't just rely on memory or reports, they rely on data, digital key cards, access logs, systems that can tell you exactly when a door was opened, who opened it, how many times it was accessed, and at what exact time it happened. Not estimates, exact times. And that changes everything, because now the question isn't what could have happened. The question is, why don't we already know what happened? Because if those logs exist, and they do, then the timeline isn't unclear, it's already mapped out. Every entry, every exit, every movement connected to that room should already be sitting in a system that can be pulled up instantly. And it doesn't stop there. These systems aren't isolated. They're often connected to cameras, entry points, hallways, doors. Some cameras run constantly, others activate when access is triggered. But either way, movement gets captured, and that creates a full picture. Not just of the room, but of everything leading into it and out of it. And that's where things start feeling heavy. Because if all of that exists, then there's no way this is just a mystery with no answers. The answers are there. They're recorded. They're stored. They can't just disappear. And yet, we're still being told a version of events that doesn't feel complete. And that's where the tension really starts building. Because now it's not about missing information. It's about information that should already be known. And that leads to a question that doesn't go away. If the system tracks everything, then why does it feel like we're not being shown everything? The moment you realize the system already has answers, the entire story starts to feel different. Because now you're not just listening to what's being said, you're measuring it against what should already be proven. And that's where things start to crack. The original explanation sounded simple, clean, almost too clean. Something that didn't need deeper investigation, something that could be accepted quickly and moved past. But that kind of simplicity doesn't hold up once you understand what's actually in place behind the scenes. Because a situation like this, in a high-end resort with full tracking systems, isn't supposed to rely on assumptions. It's supposed to rely on data, real data. And if that data doesn't fully support the explanation, then the explanation starts losing weight. That's the shift. Because now the issue isn't just what happened, it's how the story lines up with what should already be confirmed. And right now, that alignment doesn't feel solid. You can feel the gap, not just emotionally but structurally. The story moves, but it doesn't connect. It explains, but it doesn't prove. And that's where the tension really builds. Because it's one thing for people outside the situation to question things. It's completely different when the structure itself suggests those questions might be valid. Now the focus changes. It's no longer just about the outcome, it's about how that outcome was presented so quickly without showing the evidence that should support it. Because if the logs exist, if the cameras exist, if the access records exist, then the timeline should already be clear. Not vague, not incomplete, clear. But instead of clarity, there's still uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't usually exist in a system built to remove it, unless something isn't being fully shown. And that's where the story stops feeling complete and starts feeling controlled. Here's where the entire situation narrows down to something specific, not the trip, not the rumors, not even the timeline as a whole.
And now to a growing mystery, the death of an American lifestyle influencer, Ashlee Robinson, better known online as Ashlee Jenae. Now, she had been on what seemed to be a dream vacation to Zanzibar, celebrating her birthday and saying yes.
The door, because everything we've talked about so far, the systems, the logs, the structure, all of it connects to one point of truth. Who went in and who came out, that's it. That's the center of everything. In a high-end resort like this, doors aren't just doors, they're checkpoints. Every time they open, it's recorded. Every time a key is used, it leaves a trace. There's no guessing, no relying on memory. It's tracked, and that's what makes this part heavy. Because once you understand that, you realize something important. The timeline isn't actually unclear, it's just not being shown. Because if those logs were pulled, they would tell you everything. When he was moved to another room, when he first used his key, when he entered, when he exited. And even more important, whether anyone else entered her room after that. That's not speculation, that's data. And data like that doesn't lie. Which brings everything back to one question. If the system already knows the answer, then why hasn't that answer been made clear? Because if the logs showed that no one else entered, this case would already be closed. Simple, done, but it's not. And that's what makes this feel different. Because now it's not about what might have happened. It's about what the system is already showing, but hasn't been fully revealed. And that's where the tension really locks in. Because once the truth is tied to something this specific, something this trackable, it becomes harder to ignore the fact that we still don't have a clear answer. And that leads to something bigger, because if the door holds the timeline, then whatever happened is already recorded somewhere. What makes this even heavier is that it doesn't stop at the door. Because once you understand how these resorts operate, you realize the door is just one part of a bigger system. Cameras, entry points, walkways, angles that capture movement without people even thinking about it. Some are always running, others activate the moment a door is accessed. Either way, movement gets recorded, And that means the timeline doesn't just exist in logs, it exists visually too. That's where it gets uncomfortable. Because now you're not just talking about data, you're talking about actual footage. Footage that should show who approached the room, who left, and when everything happened. And in a place designed around privacy and security, those cameras aren't optional, they're standard. Which means if something happened in that space, there should be a trail leading into it and out of it, not a guess, a trail. And that's what changes how you look at everything again, because now the question isn't just about access, it's about visibility. If the system tracks movement and captures it, then there's no way this is just a situation where no one knows anything. Somebody knows. The system knows. The only question is whether that information is being fully shown, and that's where the pressure starts building again. Because if the cameras and the logs exist at the same time, they should match. They should reinforce each other. One shows the data, the other shows the movement. Together, they create a complete timeline. But instead of that complete picture, we're still looking at something that feels partial. And partial doesn't happen when full systems are in place, not unless something is being held back. And that's where this shifts from confusion to something else. Because now it's not just unclear, it's starting to feel like clarity exists, just not in public. Here's where everything starts to feel even more off. Because once you factor in the logs, the cameras, the full system that should already map out the truth, the original explanation doesn't hit the same anymore. It feels thin, like it was given too fast, without the weight of the evidence that should back it up. And that's what people are starting to notice. Because if everything really pointed in one clear direction, this case would already be closed. That's how situations like this work. When the data matches the story, there's no delay, there's no hesitation, it's done. But that didn't happen here.
Do you believe that Joe McCann had something to do with your daughter's death?
It's under investigation, and we don't know what went on.
It's under investigation, and like we said, we just want transparency.
The investigation is still open. He's still being held. And that alone says something. Because if the logs showed only one person entering, if the cameras confirmed no other movement, if everything lined up cleanly, there would be no reason to keep looking deeper. But they are, which means something doesn't fully match. And that's where the story starts breaking apart. Not loudly, not all at once, but piece by piece, because now every part of the explanation is being measured against what the system should already confirm, and that comparison isn't clean. The more you think about it, the more it feels like the explanation came before the evidence, not from it. And that's a problem, because in a situation like this, the evidence is supposed to lead everything, not follow it, not adjust to it. Lead it. And when that order feels reversed, it raises a different kind of question, not just what happened, but why it was presented the way it was so early. And that's where the tension shifts again, because now it's not just about missing details, it's about whether the details that exist were fully used in the first place. And that changes how you look at everything that comes next. What really shifts the weight of this situation is when you realize it didn't stay local. Because at some point, the concern got serious enough that it moved beyond the hotel and the local police. The US Embassy stepped in. And that's not a small detail. That doesn't happen for simple, clear-cut cases. That happens when something doesn't sit right at a higher level, when something needs to be verified independently, and once that happens, the entire situation changes because now you're dealing with oversight. External review. People who are not tied to the original narrative taking a closer look at the same evidence, and that includes the logs, the cameras, the exact data that should already explain everything, which means those records aren't just sitting in one place anymore, they're being examined from another angle, and that matters. Because if everything was already clear, there would be nothing to recheck, nothing to verify. It would already be closed, but instead it's still being looked at, still being questioned, and that creates pressure, real pressure. Because now it's not just about whether the story makes sense locally, it's about whether it holds up under independent review. And that's a completely different standard. Because once outside oversight is involved, inconsistencies don't just sit quietly, they get exposed. And that's where the situation starts feeling bigger than it originally seemed. Because now you're not just dealing with a single explanation, you're dealing with a situation where multiple layers are trying to understand the same thing. And if those layers don't align, it becomes obvious. And that's the position this case is in right now. Because if the evidence fully supported what was initially said, there would be no need for this level of involvement. But there is, and that alone raises a question that's hard to ignore. What exactly are they seeing that made them step in? Here's where things take another turn. Because once you start looking at all the systems, the logs, the cameras, the investigation, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why? Not just what happened, but why it would happen in the first place. And that's where things get complicated. Because from a business standpoint, from a resort standpoint, nothing about this situation makes sense. Someone like Ashlee isn't just another guest. She's value, she's visibility, she's influence. One post, one video, one positive experience can bring in thousands of dollars to a place like that. That's how these resorts grow. That's how they attract people.
No one wants to talk to us. Like, just let us know what happened. That's the only thing we want to know is the truth.
There is nothing that's confirmed. We don't have anything from the police or law enforcement that states that there is a conclusion to anything. It's under investigation.
So the idea that a resort would intentionally risk that kind of exposure, that kind of reputation damage, it doesn't line up. Not logically, not financially. And that's what the hotel professional was pointing out. In environments like this, guests like her are seen as assets, not liabilities, which creates a different kind of tension. Because if the environment itself doesn't benefit from something going wrong, then the focus shifts again. Now it's not just about systems or access, it's about individuals. Because most situations like this, when something serious happens, there's usually a personal component. Not random, not accidental, personal. And that's where the weight of the situation moves. Because now the question isn't just what happened in that room, it's who was directly connected to that moment, who had proximity, who had access, who was part of that final timeline. And that's where things start feeling even more serious. Because now it's not just about understanding the situation, it's about understanding the people inside it. And that's a much sharper focus. Because once you remove the idea of something random, once you remove the idea of something benefiting the environment itself, what's left is something more direct. And that's what makes this stage different. Because now the question isn't just about evidence, it's about intent. Now here's what makes this even harder to ignore. All of this, the access, the cameras, the movement, it doesn't need to be reconstructed. It already exists. The timeline isn't something investigators have to guess or rebuild from memory. It's already there, sitting inside the system. Every key card swipe, every door opening, every recorded movement is logged in real time. That means the exact sequence of events, who went where, when they moved, how often that door was accessed, it's all documented. Not loosely, precisely. And when a system like that is in place, one thing becomes very clear. There is no such thing as we don't know. The system knows. It has always known. Which raises a different kind of question. If the timeline is already mapped out down to exact minutes, then why does everything still feel unclear from the outside? Because normally, when a case has this level of data, the explanation comes directly from it. Clean, supported, final, but that's not what's happening here. Instead, we're still looking at something that feels incomplete, and that's where the tension really peaks. Because now it's not about finding the truth, it's about why the truth that already exists hasn't been fully shown, and that's a major shift. Because once you realize the answer is already recorded somewhere, the entire situation changes. It stops being a mystery in the traditional sense. It becomes something else. Something where clarity exists but isn't being fully presented. And that's what keeps people locked in. Because if the system holds the full story, then the only thing separating everyone from the truth is access to it. At this point, when you step back and look at everything together, the picture starts forming in a way that's hard to ignore. Not because every answer is clear, but because the pattern is. The systems are in place, the logs exist, the cameras exist, the timeline is already recorded. The investigation is still open, and outside oversight had to step in. Those aren't random details, those are signals. Because when a situation is simple and fully supported by evidence, it closes quickly, cleanly. But this didn't. It stretched, it escalated. It pulled in more attention instead of resolving it.
When her boyfriend popped the question, but within a few days, she was dead. CBS Weekend News anchor Jerika Duncan spoke with her family.
Ashlee Robinson was on the vacation of a lifetime. She was in Zanzibar, which is off the coast of Tanzania. She was there celebrating her 31st birthday.
And that tells you something important. The issue isn't a lack of information. It's how that information connects, or more specifically, how it doesn't fully connect in the way it should. The explanation that was given early on doesn't seem to carry the weight of everything that exists behind it. And that's what people have been reacting to this entire time, even if they didn't have the language for it. It's that disconnect between what's being said and what should already be proven. Because when the data, the timeline, and the outcome all align, there's no confusion. But when they don't, when something feels incomplete, even with all the systems in place, it creates a different kind of pressure. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that keeps pulling attention back to the same point. And that's where this situation sits right now. Not in uncertainty, but in something more specific. A gap between what exists and what's been clearly shown, and that gap is the entire story. So where does that leave everything now? Not at the beginning, not even in the middle, but at a point where the situation can't just be explained away anymore. Because at this stage, too many pieces exist for this to stay unclear forever. The systems are there, the data is there. The timeline is already recorded somewhere, and with outside oversight now involved, that information isn't just sitting untouched. It's being looked at, which means this doesn't end with speculation. It ends with verification. One way or another, what actually happened in that room is going to come out. Because when everything is tracked the way it is here, the truth doesn't disappear. It might take time, it might take pressure, it might take the right people asking the right questions, but it surfaces. And that's what makes this moment different from everything before it. Because now it's not about whether something is off. That part is already clear. The real question now is what the full timeline actually shows once it's put together completely, because that's the missing piece. The exact sequence of events confirmed by the system itself, and once that becomes visible, everything else either holds up or falls apart. And that's why this situation still feels unfinished, because we're not waiting for guesses, we're waiting for confirmation. And until that happens, this isn't a closed story. It's one that's still moving toward a point where everything finally connects.